Good morning. I'm glad that you've decided to join the Sunday school lesson for today. Today we'll be in session 10 that comes from this book or from Proverbs chapter 29 if you follow along with the Bible. There are very few things in life that happen without some sort of discipline. That might be self-discipline or it could be discipline from an outside source. But you think about athletes and doctors and scientists or teachers or preachers. All successes carry with it some amount of discipline and focus. Our lesson for today is titled Accepting Discipline. The purpose of discipline in a person's life is not for the sake of punishment, but it's to help develop skills and meet goals that lead to accomplishments and successes. A believer may also experience discipline as holiness and righteousness are cultivated. The scriptures today are part of a final section that's attributed to Solomon. These particular verses were Solomon's proverbs that had been copied by King Hezekiah, who was the king of Judah. Now that was about 200 years after Solomon's reign. Solomon was the last king to rule over an undivided Israel. After his death, the nation was divided between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. The northern section was still known as Israel, but the southern section was called Judah, and that's where Jerusalem was. So the years with kings were a little bit like a roller coaster ride. There were godly kings, and the nation flourished. There were ungodly kings, and sometimes the nation was oppressed by other people. But Hezekiah was a godly king who he repaired the temple in Jerusalem, and he took away pagan idols. And under his reign, the nation began to honor the Passover and other religious festivals again. So now today we're going to be in chapter 29, verses 1 through 3. And I'm going to read those verses now. He that being often reproved hardeneth his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. Whosoever loveth wisdom rejoices his father. But he that keepeth company with harlots spendeth his substance. People can sometimes be a stubborn lot. These verses tell us that being stiff-necked is what it was called in some of the versions, and stubborn, when discipline comes, can only lead us to a devastation. Stiff-necked, if you have the version of the Bible that use that term, refer to mules or oxen that would balk and stiffen their neck when they didn't want to go the way that they were being driven. Now, we don't want to be compared to a mule or an ox or an animal, but Israel had the problem. They believed that God was a loving and patient and forgiving God. But Solomon warned that continuous rejection, or being that stubborn, stiff-necked person, by continually rejecting God's guidance, it could result in a shattering consequences. He may have known about his older brother that was the firstborn between David and Bathsheba, and he died as an infant. So it was some bad consequences because of some choices that David had made earlier in his life. Now, people are blessed by God, and they don't need to be compared to stubborn animals, because we don't need to be that stubborn and stiff-necked. In verses 2 and 3, it speaks of the stark contrast when people reject God's will and when they seek to follow it. When righteous people are in control, that would be the people who treat others fairly because they follow God's instructions. The community or the kingdom or the nation rejoices. And likewise, when a person strives to seek and follow God's wisdom, it causes his or her parents to rejoice. But on the flip side of that coin, when wicked people take over the authoritative power in a community or in a kingdom or in a nation, the people under their jurisdiction groan over their predicament because they have no idea what may happen to them next. Also, those who reject the Lord instead of making their parents rejoice can actually cause families to lose everything they own by being wasted on foolish indulgences. So we're going to the next scriptures now, verses 12 through 14. If a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. The poor and the deceitful men meet together. The Lord lighteneth both their eyes. The king that faithfully judgeth the poor, his throne shall be established forever. Leaders impact the lives of all the people that they lead. A ruler in Solomon's day had complete control over his people, and the people had no choice except to submit to his authority. He could rule to treat people fairly, or he could rule to treat people unfairly, and those under his control had no say. They were known as the poor or the downtrodden. The kings would sometimes seek advisors, and they may not seek these particular advisors because they were corrupt, but sometimes the advisors were corrupt and they were deceivers, and they advised in ways that led the king to rule unfairly. They were deceivers, and the poor, as were called sometimes, were not necessarily those who went lacking, but those were the ones who were under that reign and had no say whatsoever about what would happen to them. They were under the reign of a monarchy, and they had no power. Solomon advised that these deceivers, the advisors who were deceivers, and the powerless have the same opportunity to seek the Lord. Corrupt leadership sought only to favor their political allies and to strengthen their power base. But then on the other hand, a righteous ruler valued integrity, and their judgments were based on their belief that all people should be treated fairly. And this leader's decisions were guided by truth instead of by power. And also, they were not evil advisors. Because of that, this kind of ruler would gain respect from the citizens, and he could expect his kingdom to flourish because God would bless it. Kings held the power of the executive. We have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial branch. The king in that day, and if it's a monarchy in any place, has rule over all three branches of government. And a righteous ruler would not only treat the powerless fair in the courtroom when he was serving in the judicial capacity, but he would also have the power to create laws, the legislative capacity, and to make sure that they showed no partiality and they were executed, which would be the executive branch. So he was all powerful. So it was very important that the kind of king or leader that the people would get. Now, the next verses move from the responsibilities of a righteous ruler to the responsibilities of righteous parents. When it's verses 15 through 17, it says, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases, but the righteous shall see their fall. Correct thy son, and he shall give thee rest. Yea, he shall give delight unto thy soul." When you see the word rod in this verse, it sounds like it's giving you permission to beat the hang out of a child, which would be close to child abuse. But if you were ever told as a child to go out and pick a switch from a bush and you got the smallest one that you could find, you found out pretty soon that it didn't matter about the size of the tool. The little switches hurt just as bad as the big ones. And this verse is not giving a parent permission to inflict pain on a defenseless child, but it is saying that parents have a responsibility to discipline their child with the child's best interest at heart. The purpose of the punishment would be to stop foolish actions, to avoid dangerous situations. I had to stop Savannah this week from sticking something into an electrical socket. And it's to correct unsuitable behaviors, and it is to be administered out of love and not anger. And it's also supposed to be proportion to the offense, not out of proportion for the offense for which it is given. A rod or corporal punishment, though, is not the only way to train a child. there's some children you've seen, you could just spank them all day long. It didn't do any good. You have to find another way. You have to teach them, first of all. You can't expect a child to know what's appropriate if you haven't taught them. So verbal explanations are necessary, and it takes time to do that. And of course, praise is certainly appropriate. Mark Twain said he could live on 2 months with a good compliment. So you want to compliment your children and praise people when they do things that are right. But in contrast to a disciplined child, there was a warning that if a child is left to himself without discipline to do as he or she pleases, then their actions very easily become selfish and foolish. And I honestly believe that children are actually born selfish. We have to teach them to be unselfish. And if you don't believe it, get those little ones and see how fast they lay claim to their toy. And it's mine, mine, mine. You have to teach them to share and to be unselfish. But the actions of undisciplined children bring shame on their parents. And they bring shame on their parents because they are the ones that are accountable for the training that they have or they have not given. Now, sadly, I believe that many parents do not take time to teach their children. They leave it into the hands of schools and churches. And the time that they spend with their children sometimes might be in the car while they drive them to some kind of ball practice or dance or music or whatever. And I'm not saying that those activities are bad. I'm just saying that parents still need to keep the priorities in order and assume the responsibilities that is a God-given responsibility. And also, unless children are taught godliness, they can grow into self-centered adults that can negatively impact an entire society. You think of all the adults that are in prison and they did something wrong, but basically it might have been because they were not disciplined as children, or in some cases they may have been abused as children and they learned that as a way of life. And you might have heard, it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. When people who ignore God or who are not taught about God gain influence in a society, in a culture, then the society adopts standards of behavior that are below and that deny God's laws. And that fact is obvious in our society today. Ungodly standards foster an ungodly culture. But Solomon warned that evil cultures are temporary. They may flourish for a season, but they cannot endure the test of time. Now, our last scriptures for today are 18 through 20. And they say, "Where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. A servant will not be corrected by words, for though he understand, he will not answer. Seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? There is more hope of a fool than of him." So the previous scriptures focused on a parent-child relationship, but verse 18 warns that God's people, the church, without a vision or a revelation or a message from God, will also perish or run wild. And that's depending on the version of the Bible that you're using as to the phrasing. In Israel's history, there were times of the judges when people did not care to hear or follow God's wisdom, and everyone did whatever seemed right to them. And at those times, society became chaotic. The same holds true today. God's instruction is essential to the preservation of a godly society. And it seems in our current world that people try to remove God from everything possible. And the warning from verse 18 and all through the Bible holds true just as much today as it did in Solomon's time. Verse 19 says that just because a servant hears the words of correction doesn't mean that he's going to change his ways. A servant at that time, or in these writings, was a person who was indebted to another. They might have been a slave, or they may have been an indentured servant, and they were working to pay off their debt. At times, the discipline was needed to bring about a desired change in their attitude or their actions because the words alone were not accepted by the servant. Well, God's people are servants too, and we owe God for all his blessings and what he's done for us. We can't ever repay it. But God gives us instructions or words, hoping to create desired changes in our lives. But we're like the servants of Solomon's days, and sometimes we choose to ignore those instructions from God. We're like the person in verse 20. We want to talk more than we listen. We can't hear God speak to us or anyone else who's given us godly instruction because we're too busy speaking our own mind and our own opinion and our own beliefs. And that's based on our personal beliefs and not what God says. So that's when God might use other forms of discipline. And it's not to punish us, but it's to guide us to a different approach to life. God's discipline is to help individuals not only hear, but also go on to obey his godly instructions. Now, we live in a fast-paced, busy, noisy world. And our lives, as we have lived them, have been changed drastically with the onset of COVID-19. You might want to ask, could we need that slowing down of our activities to have the time to spend with our families as family units the way God intended, with parents taking on the full responsibility of teaching their children? There's no school, there's no church. It's just the parents, the mom and the daddy and the children. Did we need and do we need to talk less with our complaining or just going on with the business of life to hear God's instructions? Did we need COVID because we were not adhering to instructions like the servant from verse 20? And then we might want to ask ourselves this: how am I responding to God's instructions? And how do I respond to God's discipline? Because we all have it from time to time. And I want to thank you for joining again today. And I pray that we'll all continue to be praying for our world. We all share this world, and I'm talking about from our local communities and our local leaders all the way up through international leaders. And I hope that you'll be able to join again next week. I'll be here unless something happens, and I plan to be here. Thank you so much.